Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well, of course. We are quickly approaching the end of our course. I hope you'll look back on it fondly, let's say. I will. So we've gone through Descartes, we've gone through the first four meditations, right? And we need to carry that with us now. We can't forget about Descartes. We are going to study John Perry's book, Dialogue on Consciousness. You should have read the first dialogue by now. And having read it, you know that Descartes is an important resource. This is often how philosophy works now in the 21st century. We know some theories and some concepts from classic works of philosophy, and now we're refining them and applying them to contemporary issues, right? That's what's going on in this book, right? So you might have thought Descartes was dated, but I hope you can see from reading this book that his ideas are actually relevant and they're helping inform the discussion in the book, right? Okay, so the way this book works is it's divided up into three smaller dialogues. They're called Monday, Wednesday, Friday, because the characters have supposedly decided to meet on these 3 days, right? They're going to meet for lunch on these three different days over the course of 1 week. And then ostensibly this is because it's spring break, right? So the professor, Gretchen Wyrob, has some free time. Dave Cohen is supposed to be a student. He's got some free time. Sam Miller is a local minister, and his hours are flexible, let's say. He complains in the dialogue that Gretchen sort of misrepresents how much free time he has. But his hours are flexible. I mean, that's often how it is when you're a minister. That's how it is when you're a professor too. So actually, I would say, from my experience as a professor, my father was a minister. I would say it's sort of similar in terms of the flexibility. Like there's plenty of work, but you could rearrange things pretty easily so you can show up for a philosophical discussion at lunchtime. Okay, so let's start with Sam Miller here. So he's the minister, right? His perspective is a religious one, not surprisingly. He is keen on getting dualism to work somehow, right? And that's because dualism either supports the immortality of the soul or it's obviously compatible with the immortality of the soul. Descartes' own version of dualism supports immortality of the soul, right? Because Descartes thought that the mind was actually radically distinct from the body. That's part of what we should have gotten from our reading of Descartes. And since it's radically distinct, then obviously the mind can be separated from the body, right? So Sam comes into the discussion wanting dualism in some form to work out. Professor Wyrob comes into the discussion wanting some kind of materialism to work out. She actually announces pretty early in the chapter that she's a materialist, and we'll come back to that point in a minute and flesh out what that means. Dave Cohen seems to be, he's a philosophy student, by the way. Wyrob, of course, is a philosophy professor specifically, if I didn't say that already. I don't think I did. So Dave Cohen is a philosophy major. He's one of our Y-Rob students, and he seems to be somewhere in the middle. He likes to help with arguments, right, as you'll see. So he doesn't think a whole lot of Descartes' arguments, and basically his role is to translate sometimes what Professor Wyrob is saying into terms that Sam Miller will understand, and his role is also to help Sam Miller develop his insights into arguments, which then can be presented to Professor Wyrob, and then she can sort of critically analyze them, right? I mean, that's the basic setup. That's the structure. They're meeting for lunch, and again, Dave is helping Sam use his insights to develop arguments, which can be presented to Professor Wyrob, who can say what she thinks of those arguments, right? Okay, so I already mentioned Professor Wyrob says she's a materialist pretty early on, but she makes an important qualification. She says, I'm not an eliminative materialist. I'm a non-eliminative materialist. And by the way, there will be another qualification later. She'll say, I'm not really a materialist, I'm a physicalist, but let's save that discussion for later. What does it mean that she's a non-eliminative materialist? Well, the way that she explains it is by talking about the difference between how we think about phlogiston now. I guess the dialogues are supposed to take place in the 1970s, so now is the 70s. Sorry for the temporal confusion, but that is part of the setup here. So we're somewhere in the 70s. Anyway, there's a difference between how we think about phlogiston now and how we think about stars, right? And how we think about our past thoughts about stars. Okay, let's get into the example. That probably sounded weird. So, as I've mentioned previously, the humans, we didn't know what fire was for a long time. The Greeks thought it was a specific substance, right? They thought there were these four, or many of them did. Aristotle, in particular, thought there were these four basic elements. There was earth, air, fire, and water, right? And so fire was some kind of substance along those lines, right? You can see what it was being compared to. Much later, scientists, let's say in the 1700s, we're in the modern period, but we're not in the contemporary period. Scientists developed this view that phlogiston, there was a specific substance. They didn't think fire was a substance anymore, but they thought there was this specific substance called phlogiston that made things flammable. So nothing would catch fire unless it had phlogiston in it. Now, of course, that's not our view now, right? Our view now is fire is a process. It's typically a process of oxidization, right? Things become oxidized, that is to say, oxygen blends with the molecular or atomic makeup that's already there, and that process is hot and bright, and that's what fire is. It's the heat and the light emitted by this powerful chemical process of oxidization, right? Okay, but anyway, at some point people thought there was this thing called phlogiston, which was a substance which made things flammable, right? So we can eliminate phlogiston from our view of the world, right? Because now we know what fire really is. It's this process in which things become oxidized, right? This these molecules become these other molecules, right? And that process emits energy in the form of heat and light, right? So we don't need phlogiston. We can get rid of it. We can remove it from our vocabulary and from our set of ideas. Now, stars, on the other hand, that's another thing that people didn't really know the nature of a long time ago. I mean, Aristotle did not think that the sun was a big gassy thing in which fusion was occurring every moment. And again, heat and light are emitted because of the fusion process, right? Yeah, Aristotle didn't know that. Confucius, who's mentioned in the text, didn't know that. But Aristotle and Confucius talked about stars, and when we talk about stars, we're talking about the same thing that they were. Right, so we've got two different kinds of cases. We've got the case of phlogiston. Phlogiston can be eliminated because we don't need it anymore. There's no point in talking about it anymore. Stars, though, we continue to talk about. We just think that Aristotle and Confucius and a lot of other people were confused about what stars really are. But we take ourselves to be talking about the same thing, right? Confucius said what? Stars were little holes in the sky that let the light of infinity through, something like that. You know, you look up in the night sky, you see stars, and you think, oh, that's what Confucius was talking about. So in the case of phlogiston, there's nothing to point at and say that's what they were talking about. We just don't think there's any phlogiston. They were just wrong. In the case of stars, we think, oh, they were talking about that, but we know that stars are really big gassy balls that are undergoing fusion, right? So Professor Wyrob is saying the mind is like stars and not like phlogiston. She's a materialist about the mind, so she thinks the mind is the brain, but she's not trying to eliminate the mind. She's not trying to say the mind doesn't exist. She thinks it exists. She thinks there are beliefs and desires and conscious experiences. There are some materialists who say that's all illusory somehow. Those things don't really exist. We understand things better now. We can get rid of beliefs and desires. We shouldn't talk about things that way. That's not Wyrob's view. She thinks we talk about the mind in a fairly sophisticated way, that we've been talking about the mind in a fairly sophisticated way for a long time. But now we understand that the mind is really a brain. Just like now we understand that a star is a big gassy giant undergoing a process of fusion. We didn't understand that before. So if Plato and Aristotle and Descartes talk about minds, we know what they're talking about, but we have this view of what a mind is that they didn't have. That's Professor Wyrob's view. We know that minds are brains now. Now, of course, that's not something philosophers have wholeheartedly agreed on, so I don't want you to get that idea from the text. This is one philosophy professor, among others, and she happens to be a materialist, right? She does actually say later property dualism is now a respectable position, so pay attention to that. There is a certain kind of dualism that's gained some popularity among philosophers. But this particular philosophy professor, okay, she's a non-eliminative materialist. We know what that means now. She believes there are minds. She's not trying to say they don't exist. She's trying to say a lot of our discourse about minds in the past has been correct, but there's this thing that we didn't know about what minds really are, and now we know it. Okay? I hope that's pretty clear. All right, so going from there, the point at which Rob comes out as a materialist, we get a rehearsal of Descartes' arguments. We don't need to go over that in any depth, right, because we know how that works. The way that the basic argument is presented in the text is familiar to us. It has to do with doubt, right? I can easily doubt that I have a body, but I can't really doubt that I have a mind and that I'm thinking. Therefore, I really am my mind. My mind seems to be separable from my body. I can think about my mind existing in these scenarios in which there aren't any bodies. So conceptually they come apart, so it seems like minds and bodies are different. They're separable, right? I mean, that's basically, now we're not studying Descartes anymore. So that's basically it, right? That's the gist of it. That's how the argument is initially presented. Now, of course, that argument is easy to criticize, and we have criticized it. We tried to refine it and make a more sophisticated argument, right? So they criticize it in the text. I don't want to spend a long time on the criticism because we've already criticized that argument. But the criticism is interestingly different here. The way Rob approaches the argument is to say, well, it's a case of misplaced negation, right? The fallacy of misplaced negation, right? In other words, Descartes initially says, I don't know that the mind is a body, and then he switches it to, I know that the mind is not a body, right? So he's moved the not around in an illegitimate way. Again, I do not know that the mind is a body versus I know that the mind is not a body. So that's simplistic, right? So that's a simplistic version of the argument. It's a simplistic criticism, but that's okay. The conversation continues. They clarify the argument. They refine it. Reverend Miller, on pages 7 to 8, puts the argument forward this way. We observe our own thinking, believing, perceiving, remembering, and we don't notice any material stuff involved in it. We can examine our thinking all day long, and we don't perceive anything material, right? Then we study the body and the brain, and we don't notice anything like a thought or an image there. So the mind and the body have different properties, right? That's a better way of looking at Descartes' argument. What kind of properties does the mind have? Well, there's phenomenality. It has a certain anything in the mind has a certain phenomenal appearance. Minds are conscious. Minds are subjective. What about material stuff? Well, as Descartes pointed out, that stuff is extended. It takes up space, right? So mind and body have different properties. Well, things that have different properties are different. They would have to have properties in common to turn out to be the same. And then when you look at them, it seems they don't have any properties in common. So that's the way Miller begins to massage the argument and make it more palatable, right? Okay, so that takes up a lot of pages then. Basically, the issue is identity. Are the mind and brain identical? Rob thinks they are. Miller is trying to say that they're not. Right? That fits in with her non-eliminative materialism, right? She's willing to talk about minds. She's not saying we should throw the term mind out. But what we've discovered is they're actually brains. So she has an identity thesis. Miller has a non-identity thesis. I think it'll be helpful to, keep coming back to this general framing, identity versus non-identity. Okay, well, why Rob is not impressed, right, with Miller's presentation so far. She mentions Clark Kent and Superman, right? Well, which, by the way, is convenient because there's a wonderful new Superman movie out. I just saw it with my kids over the weekend. I recommend it. Anyway, Superman and Clark Kent are the same person, but a lot of people don't know that, right? So Miller is trying to say the mind and brain are really the same. They have different properties. Rob is responding by saying, well, Clark Kent and Superman have some properties that are different. Clark Kent appears clumsy. That's part of the fun, right? It's a very dexterous, fast, strong person. But then when he's pretending to be Clark Kent, he has to act like an oaf, right? So Clark Kent appears to be clumsy. He is a reporter. He wears glasses, right? Superman doesn't have a job as far as we know. Doesn't wear glasses. Dresses up in a special superhero suit. Has a cape, right? So we can list these different properties that Clark Kent and Superman have, and we can say, well, they're different because they have different properties, right? To elaborate more on that, Rob goes on to say, look, the mind and the brain, you're trying to say they don't share any properties at all, but they're both part of the causal realm. That is to say, an intention is mental, right? So I could have an intention to grasp a pen and hold it up. Well, that has physical consequences, right? So my mind participates in the causal realm in the real world. If it didn't, how would we even know I had a mind? Maybe I would know, but you wouldn't know, right? I appear to have an intention because I actually do things in the real world. So the mind participates in the causal realm. So does the brain. I mean, obviously, there are processes in the brain that kick my nervous system into gear so that the nerves in my arm move toward the pen, and then the nerves in my fingers move the fingers so that they grasp the pen, right? There's this sort of mechanical process that occurs. It's initiated by my intention. As far as the physical process goes, it seems to start in the brain and end here where my fingers are holding the pen, right? Doesn't that make sense? So the mind and brain have something in common, right? They participate in the causal realm, and in fact, we could dig into that. We could dig into that and say, here are some parts of the brain that light up when I have an intention. Here are some parts of the brain that light up when my arm is moving towards something to grasp it, right? We've got some idea how the brain works. We know its topography. In other words, we know that different parts are associated with different kinds of conscious experiences, right? So they do have something in common. Okay. Now, going back to the non-identity thesis, right? So that was That was Rob arguing for the identity thesis. Reverend Miller wants to support non-identity, so what does he say? He says, look, if you watch Clark Kent long enough, eventually you'll see him duck into a phone booth, and maybe you'll see him change clothes, maybe give him some privacy. Don't do that, right? Anyway, you'll see him go into the phone booth, and you'll see Superman fly out, and you'll say, "Oh, okay." Right? And maybe you'll go look, and you'll see Clark Kent's clothes folded up in there. I don't know exactly what Superman does with those clothes, but if you're fast enough, you're not going to be as fast as Superman. But if you're fast enough, you'll see some trace. You'll realize there's some connection between these two. On the other hand, you can't see thoughts, right? You could look at the brain all day long, and you won't see a thought. That's what Miller says. And then Dave Cohen, the student, he wants to use his knowledge of the history of philosophy here to bolster what Miller is saying. So Dave Cohen brings up two different philosophers. Oh, sorry. Dave Cohen brings up Leibniz. It's Rob who brings up A.C. Ewing. Okay. So Cohen says, Leibniz has this point that he makes about the brain being like a mill. So in a mill, you've got a lot of gears turning. I don't know if you know much about mills, but let's imagine one powered by a river that's flowing. That's a common way for a mill to run. So it's sitting on a river, and the river is putting the big water wheel into motion, right? And then that motion has to be transmitted to machines inside the mill. So there are all these spinning gears, right? So imagine that the brain is blown up to a very large size, and you're walking around in it. Leibniz says, well, we all know the brain is a mechanical thing, so it's like a mill, right? So you're walking around and you're seeing these mechanical occurrences. I mean, that's compatible with what we believe now. The mill wouldn't be the first thing we'd bring up to make an analogy. But we do think organic beings are like big molecular machines. So there's some kind of molecular machinery in the brain, and you could blow it up really big, and you could look around, and you wouldn't see subjective experience, nor would we even know what that would be like. That comes up later as well. Like, what kind of thing could you possibly see in the brain that would count as a subjective experience when it is in fact out there and not in your own mind? Well, I personally don't know. All right, so again, remember, this is supporting the non-identity thesis. The brain is really a machine. If you went inside and looked around, you'd see mechanical processes going on. You wouldn't see any mental stuff. You wouldn't see it. So the mind and the brain are different. Rob is the one that brings up A.C. Ewing. So she's sort of taking Miller's side for a bit. So Ewing says the materialist should grab a red-hot poker, which, is kind of an aggressive thing to say. The point being that, that horrible experience of pain that you'll get when you grab the red-hot poker is very different from any kind of mechanical process that you might observe. Right. So again, Ewing is also making this point that the brain is a physical thing, right? And you could look at the brain and see what's happening in it when a pain occurs, but that's very different from the actual experience of grabbing a red hot poker. So again, non-identity, right? Rob is for some reason helping to bolster the case for non-identity. I guess she just thought of Ewing and had to mention it, right? Okay, and then Dave Cohen ends up flipping sides as well. I guess this just keeps things interesting. So Perry was having his fun here. Cohen mentions the movie Fantastic Voyage, which you probably haven't seen. It's an old movie, right? Starring Arthur Kennedy and Raquel Welch. Anyway, for our purposes, let's just say in this movie, we've got some people in a submarine navigating through a brain. We don't really need to go over the plot. And as they're navigating through the brain, they see some blue bubbles off in the distance. And one of them says, "Oh, a thought. We're the first humans to see a thought," right? So Dave Cohen is pointing out that some people don't think this idea of seeing a thought is problematic. On the other hand, as everyone eventually agrees, well, who's whose word are you going to take here, right? We've got some fictional characters in a movie written by someone who may not know anything about the mind or the brain versus some philosophers who are saying, look, objective physical things are very different from subjective experiences, right? They have different properties. They can't really be the same. But still, this is an important piece of evidence. People like Ewing and Leibniz do think they're saying something very intuitive, right? Look, subjective experience is just different. They think these thought experiments, grab a hot poker, go inside the brain when it gets magnified 1,000 times or whatever. They think these thought experiments are refining our intuitions, right? So they do think it's intuitive, that subjective experience is very different from physical stuff. So the movie at least does cast some doubt on that. Well, it's not that intuitive because look, here's this silly movie in which someone pointed at some blue stuff and said there's a thought. Okay, so that's somewhat interested, but we don't need to worry too much about Fantastic Voyage. Okay, Professor Rob is somewhat moved by Leibniz and Ewing, not so much by Fantastic Voyage. And she says, okay, look, maybe Leibniz has a point, but I can't accept substance dualism. That's Descartes' view, that the mind and the brain are distinct substances. They're different things, right? Rob says, look, maybe I could be a property dualist instead of a substance dualist. So what's the difference there? Well, again, Descartes thinks that the mind and the brain are these different things. They're different substances. The way that Rob at least defines property dualism is she says, look, the brain has physical properties and the brain has mental or non-physical properties, right? So the brain has these subjective, phenomenal, experiential properties, right? All those properties are caused by and reside in the brain. So there's chemical, molecular stuff in the brain, and then there are these other properties, non-physical, right? They don't. Let's say they don't take up any space. Let's concede that that's so. What have we gained, right? That's what Miller wants to know right off the bat. Well, how is property dualism any better than Descartes' position? Well, the thing is, as we surely know by now, Descartes' position leads to worries about how the mind and the body could possibly interact, right? If the mind is really non-extended, if it really doesn't take up any space, and then the body is defined by its taking up of space, how could the two interact? They can't interact through contact, right? How can a non-extended thing, a thing that takes up no space, participate in physical contact? Well, it seems that it couldn't. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia is mentioned here. She was the first one historically to point this out. So Princess Elizabeth corresponded with Descartes. They wrote letters back and forth. And Princess Elizabeth pointed out that, when physical things interact, it's a little more complicated than what they say in this dialogue. I've read Princess Elizabeth's letters, but the gist of it is pretty much physical things interact through some kind of contact, right? Even if I see something, like I've got some things on my desk in front of me, there's contact involved. There are photons bouncing off of those things that came in from the outside. There's sunlight out there. Photons are streaming in. They're bouncing off things into my eye, and I'm getting an image of the thing on my desk as a result. There's contact. There's either immediate contact. I could touch the pen, and I feel it. It's doing something to my nerves so that I have a tactile sensation. Or there's indirect contact because of the stream of photons coming in and bouncing off the pen and going into my eyes. Okay, so anyway, Elizabeth's point is, I don't see how a non-extended thing and an extended thing can interact. I don't see it, Descartes. And he never did answer in a satisfactory way. He had an answer. He said a lot of words. I wouldn't say, I've read the correspondence. I wouldn't say that he had a good response. You could read it for yourself sometime and see what you think. More broadly, as Professor Wyrob points out, dualism created a crisis in the history of philosophy. So Princess Elizabeth was the first to point out the problem of interaction, but she wasn't the last. People kept pointing it out, and they kept worrying about it. So let's not worry too much about Berkeley and Leibniz's, well, I should say Berkeley's and Leibniz's different versions of idealism. Let's not worry too much about that. But let's do say, look, you've probably heard of Professor George Berkeley, or Bishop George Berkeley, he's a well-known philosopher, right? You've probably heard of G.W. Leibniz, who was a famous philosopher. Well, even if you haven't, they're well known, right? If you were a philosophy major, you would have to study some of their ideas, right? So the point is here that they both took up idealist positions, right? Idealism means that you reject the physical world in some way. You say that the physical world is an illusion, right? So Berkeley specifically denied that there were material substances. That's the phrase that Berkeley uses all the time. There's no such thing as a material substance. Rather, what's happening is God is sort of creating this realm of ideas in which we're all able to operate virtually. It's like a video game. Now, Berkeley didn't play video games, and he didn't know what one was. But from our point of view, being a little anachronistic, it's as if we were all participating in a video game with God. God is sort of the architect of the video game, and we're participating in it. It's completely virtual. There's no physical aspect to it, right? So you could see the world in that way, right? I invite you to think about it. What that does for Berkeley is it gets him out of the interaction problem, right? We don't know how a physical thing and a non-physical thing, or an extended thing and a non-extended thing, could possibly interact. So instead of having them interact, Berkeley says everything is really just mental or virtual, if you like, right? There are minds and there are mental contents, but there's no physical stuff. And then Leibniz had a similar view. He believed that there were these things called monads that were capable of having experiences, and some of them were more sophisticated than others. But in any case, we're sort of made out of monads. Like, there's a super monad within us that's very sophisticated and capable of rational thought, and then there are lesser monads that make up our bodies. But it amounts to the same thing in a way, because Leibniz is also an idealist. Leibniz says extension is imaginary. He uses that term, right? So, in other words, we have an impression of extension. In our visual field, things are extended, but that doesn't match up to actual extension. Rather, these monads are coordinated in the experiences that they have by God, of course. God sets up the monads so that their experiences are parallel in somehow, right? So it's as if there's a physical world that's keeping the monads in sync, right? It's as if they're participating in a shared physical world, but that's not really what's happening. God just sort of sets the monads into motion internally so that they're having experiences, but there's no physical world causing them to have experiences. So there's a shared virtual world. Well, again, don't worry too much about the details of Berkeley and Leibniz. The main point is they're idealists. Why? Well, they didn't know how to solve the interaction problem. I mean, it's, of course it's more complicated than that, but you can see historically that Leibniz and Berkeley were both worried about Cartesian dualism. They didn't know how to get it to work. And so it seemed like you either had to be an idealist and say everything is really mental, or you had to be a materialist and say everything is really physical. And, there were plenty of materialists after Descartes as well. It seemed like you had to pick a lane, right? But if you're a property dualist, maybe you don't have to pick a lane. Maybe you could say, well, there's a brain, and it's got non-physical / mental properties, and it's got physical properties, and they interact through the brain, right? So again, that's why property dualism is an improvement over substance dualism. So both of them solve, both of them solve Miller's problem, which is, well, how can the soul be real? I mean, he's coming at it from a religious perspective. He thinks there's an immortal soul, so he wants that to work out. So both substance dualism and property dualism support Miller well enough, but substance dualism comes with this interaction problem. Property dualism doesn't have the interaction problem. So Rob is somewhat willing to entertain property dualism. She ultimately doesn't think it's correct, but she can see the force of what Leibniz and Ewing are saying. So she at least feels somewhat attracted to property dualism. Okay, I hope all of that makes sense, but you can let me know. You could post a question in the discussion forum and ask about any of the videos, of course. All right. So Miller basically decides he's going to be a property dualist, and so he adopts that identity for the rest of the dialogues, not just the Monday dialogue, but for the rest of the book. Miller holds to this idea that, okay, well, now I'm a property dualist. And then to be clear, I've said something along these lines before, but now I can be a little more specific. Substance dualism directly supports the immortality of the soul. Property dualism doesn't, right? Because according to property dualism, the non-physical or mental properties do reside in the brain, or at least that's the version of property dualism that's being discussed in the text. So then it's certainly possible that when the brain ceases to exist, all those non-physical properties go away. So we don't have to say they do, right? So property dualism is a better bet for Miller than materialism is. So he's sticking with property dualism as a sort of middle ground. Like, he doesn't think he can defend substance dualism because of the interaction problem, but at least property dualism allows that the mind and the brain have separate properties, which is important to him. He hasn't articulated why yet, except for the immortality issue. There are other issues there that will emerge later. It's important to Miller that he not just be a physical thing, and probably a lot of us share that desire, or even that aspiration to not just be some physical thing, right? So Miller is occupying this middle ground of property dualism. And I'll quote from him now. This is from page 17. He now holds that, quote, mental states and activities are immaterial or non-physical properties of the brain that influence and are influenced by the physical properties of the brain. Okay, so that's his definition of property dualism that he's committed to now. And then another thing that the characters say is that, look, we can see thoughts according to property dualism. So this has been an important issue. Can you see thoughts, or can you not see thoughts? So with all due respect to Leibniz, the characters at least agree at this point, well, you can see thoughts, but you can't see the properties that make something a thought, right? In other words, if property dualism is true, then of course thoughts are in the brain. And so you could look at a certain brain process, right, that corresponds to some non-physical properties that constitute a thought, and you can say that's the thought, right there. But you can't see the properties that make that thought a thought. You can just see the physical correlates. All right, I hope that makes sense. But again, you could post a question about it if it's still not clear. Okay. Now Professor Wyrob moves on to this other idea of an autocerebroscope. This is an idea that comes from Herbert Feigl. So Wyrob imagines she's hooked up to an autocerebroscope, and that just means she can look at her brain. She can look at her brain while she's having experiences. So, for instance, she could, in theory, grab a red hot poker and she could see what's going on in her brain when she grabs the red hot poker. And then, according to what we've already said, she would see the experience of pain, but she wouldn't see the properties that make it a pain. Right, there's something happening in the brain that we can call the pain, and it's got to have some physical properties. It is there in the brain happening, after all. So there have to be some physical things going on that we can see, and then there's some non-physical aspect of it that makes it a pain, right? But that stuff is experiential and subjective and phenomenal. Excuse me, so we can't see that stuff when we look at the brain. Even if she's looking at her own brain. And that just makes things vivid, right? She can have the experience of grabbing the red hot poker and see what's going on in her own brain when she grabs the red hot poker. So that just helps us, again, make things vivid. So I'm having this kind of experience and this kind of experience. And I can see there's some kind of discrepancy. There's physical process, and then there's this powerful, vivid, subjective experience that I'm having. And yes, they're very different. Wyrob is conceding, right? Okay, now at this point, Wyrob does want to make a distinction between materialism and physicalism, and this will turn out to be rather important to her view, ultimately, right? So she wants to say, look, materialism is an idea that does go back to these reactions to Descartes, right? So typically, if I'm a materialist, I'm thinking about physical properties like extension, like location. Like these are actually macro properties, is her point. Right, at the quantum level, things are a little different. But, Descartes didn't know anything about the quantum level, so neither Descartes nor the people responding to Descartes were thinking of quantum properties, nor were they even thinking about gravity when the interaction crisis initially occurred, right? When the interaction crisis initially occurred, the ideas we had of the physical world were, it takes up space, and specific things have specific locations, and they can move at definite speeds, right? So materialism construes the world in a mechanical sort of way. So in a way, we could say material properties are those that machines have, right? So the reason Professor Wyrob wants to be a physicalist and not a materialist is that, there are properties that don't fit into that mechanical worldview, right? gravity, a robust theory of gravity came after Descartes. Gravity is action at a distance. It doesn't involve physical contact. Um, it was kind of people would have said it was spooky, maybe, or something like that. If you had tried to explain gravity to someone like Descartes, who hadn't worked through it the way Newton had, right? Descartes would have said that doesn't make sense. Right? He knows things fall to the earth. He's aware of that, but action at a distance, right? The idea of a gravitational force field around the earth, right? That's something that Descartes probably would have said doesn't make sense. It's not a mechanical sort of thing. An electromagnetic field, also not a mechanical sort of thing. The charm of some quantum particle, which I don't really know much about, not a mechanical thing. So Professor Weirob's point is, look, physical things have lots of different kinds of properties. They do have these properties that allow them to participate in mechanical processes, but they also have these other weird properties. And so there's no reason that physical things couldn't have the properties that constitute a mind, right? And then her point is, now she's starting to move away from property dualism. She's starting to criticize it. There's no reason we would have to say that those properties aren't physical. We could just say they're physical properties, but they're not material properties. All right, so that's the point of going toward physicalism and saying she's a physicalist and not a materialist, right? So you use the autocerebroscope. You look at your own brain when you grab the red hot poker. If you're just looking for things like extension and location and speed and velocity, you're never going to see anything that matches up to a subjective experience, right? So Professor Weirab is conceding that point. But she's saying also that, well, with the right kind of equipment, you could possibly observe physical properties that aren't really material properties. So you could observe an electromagnetic field, perhaps the autocerebroscope could reveal an electromagnetic field for us. Maybe it could reveal a gravitational field. I mean, we don't know how that would work mechanically, and she's not explaining it here. But we're just supposing. We're just doing thought experiments. So maybe ultimately the autocerebroscope could detect physical properties that constitute the mind. And basically, Professor Weirab is saying, well, why not? Because she can't say anything more robust than that, because she doesn't have any kind of strong explanation about how a physical brain could cause a subjective phenomenal mind to come into being. Humans don't have a good explanation for that yet. But what she's doing is she's opening up conceptual room, or she's trying to. She's saying, look, there are weird physical properties that Descartes didn't know about and didn't expect anyone to discover. But we take them for granted now. We take gravity and electromagnetism and quantum effects for granted now. So there must be room in the physical world for this mental stuff, so we don't need dualism. We don't even need property dualism. Um, well, there's a lot of, for lack of a better term, there's a lot of faith there. I mean, to be blunt, from my point of view. Now I'm speaking, right? So Professor Wyrob has had her say. I've tried to explain her view. Um, I think there's a lot of faith there. I think she's a committed physicalist, right? She has some kind of what I would have to call an ideological commitment. She's sure that science has been working well for us, and science is going to figure this out. Science is going to detect the right physical properties that we need in order to understand how the brain creates a mind. Somehow this is all going to pan out. But she doesn't have a detailed story of how a brain can create a mind. And then Dave Cohen, the student, comes back to this point on page 21, if that matters, if you want to look at where we are. And he says, look, there's nothing we could conceive of seeing with the autocerebroscope that would count as an experience. So you're saying, we could change the autocerebroscope, we could modify it so that we can see all these physical properties, and eventually we'll find some that explain the mind, that constitute the mind, both probably explain and constitute. Cohen says, I can't conceive of that. I can't conceive of seeing something in the objective world that's the same thing as a subjective experience that I'm having. I agree with Cohen's point. Like, I can't conceive of that either. And so now we have to end on Professor Wyrob's counter to that. You can tell I don't find it satisfying, probably, so I might as well be honest about that. She says, look, using the autocerebroscope and looking at my pain while having the pain is like this. It's like you're looking in a mirror and you've got chocolate on your tongue. And so you're seeing in the mirror, I don't know why I stuck my tongue out at you. That probably doesn't help anything, but there it is again. You're looking in the mirror, you're seeing the chocolate on your tongue, you're tasting the chocolate. You know there's a correspondence. You know that the chocolate being there on your tongue has something to do with the taste of it, but the experiences are very different. But you know that they're causally correlated. So isn't that how we should look at the discrepancy between experiencing a red hot pain and then looking in the autocerebroscope and seeing the physical, chemical, molecular correlate? Right? Isn't it like that? No. Sorry, my own view is getting in the way here. No, it's not like that. Right? I mean, ultimately, there's a physical piece of chocolate that you can identify through different sensory modalities that is responsible for what you're seeing and for what you're tasting. And that's the whole question here. Is there a physical thing that's responsible for these experiences, or do experiences float free of anything physical? Is there some physical thing in which both the taste of the chocolate and the vision of the chocolate coming from the mirror in here? Or do they not need a physical substrate to occur together? Right? It's an interesting attempt, right? But ultimately, too different. It's too different. Again, you already know that the taste of the chocolate and the sight of the chocolate are correlated going into the thought experiment. And so you're getting back from the thought experiment what you already knew, right? But if we really don't know that the mind is physical, we're really not sure, and we don't know if it needs a physical substrate or not. The example doesn't really prove anything. I guess, trying to be generous to Rob, she is trying to make conceptual room. But at the same time, this new thought experiment doesn't add anything to the conceptual space that she already carved out. So let's grant her that she's carved out this conceptual space in which it's possible that the brain has these physical properties that completely account for the mind's existence. We don't know what they are. We haven't found them. We don't actually have an autocerebroscope that we could use to find them. But okay, that makes sense. If we are willing to be property dualists, maybe we also ought to be willing to say, oh, maybe those properties are physical after all, because we don't really know what the physical world is. But now it's become 6 of one and half dozen of the other, right? If you'll bear with me for a minute longer here, we could be property dualists and say the brain has physical properties and non-physical properties, or we could be physicalists and say, well, the brain has physical properties and then it has other physical properties, but of course these aren't physical properties we've described yet, and we don't know what they are, and we can't really say much about them, but they're there, and they're causing us to have a mind. That's why I say 6 of one and half dozen of the other. The property dualists are saying, well, we've got some properties that don't fit into our current conception of the physical world. Gretchen Rob is also saying, oh, I don't know which physical properties these are. I can't describe them to you. So she's also saying that there are these properties that don't fit into our current conception of the physical world, right? So now we're having a verbal dispute. So in a way, she's adopting property dualism, or she's conceding so much to the property dualists that you can't really tell their positions apart. Okay, well, sorry to end on that sort of indefinite note, but I believe that's where Monday ends. I believe that's where the Monday chapter actually ends. I don't think things are very neatly resolved there, and really they're not supposed to be. Right? You're supposed to have set up some tantalizing, intriguing possibilities that will be explored on Wednesday and Friday. Okay, so we'll have to leave it there. Thank you.